Welcome to the place where we learn about improv, 'cause public speaking can take you so far. Improv speaking, say yes and flex your creative thinking. Improv speaking, say yes and flex your creative thinking.
Welcome, everyone, to another fantastic episode of the Improvly Speaking podcast. Calling it now. Going to be so fun. This is going to be a blast and a little different today in terms of topics and stuff. So I'm excited to weave in and connect improv to our guest. I'm your host, Dana Gowan. I'm excited to be here, excited to share this awesome guest with you. Thanks for joining today. If you're new, joining us for the first time, thanks for joining. Let me tell you a little bit about what this podcast is about. One, we're here to help people and you understand the benefits of improvisation and applied improvisation. Two, to demonstrate how improv shows up in all aspects of our lives, which I think we'll definitely hit today. And three, to inspire you to try new things, get out of your head and judgment zones, and find a creative passion and outlet that can help you and serve you. And again, I think we're going to really hit on that today too. Our guest today may not call himself an official quote unquote improviser, but he is definitely an improviser through dance and flexibility and so much more. We'll focus a lot on dance today, improvised dance, if you will, and expressive arts. So let's jump in with our very special guest, Dr. Bob Swoap. Dr. Swoap is a professor of psychology and expressive arts therapy at Warren Wilson College, which is close to Asheville, North Carolina, where he teaches and conducts research in clinical and health psychology. Some of his research includes investigating the relationship between stress, hostility, and heart health, the impact of exercise on children and college students in the classroom, the benefits of mindfulness-based practices in first responders and college students, and the impact of ketamine-assisted group psychotherapy. Super interesting. We'll get into that a little bit too. Bob is a licensed clinical psychologist who utilizes evidence-based interventions with patients experiencing chronic pain, chronic illness, anxiety, depression, and other forms of psychological distress. He conducts sports psychology interventions with athletes, teams, and coaches, and he's worked with a few Olympians too. He also works with the Center for Conscious Living and Dying, a community that embodies living a meaningful life through exploration, growth, service, and community-supportive end-of-life care. Bob completed his psychology undergraduate work and postdoctoral fellowship in behavioral medicine at Duke University and earned his doctorate in clinical and health psychology from the University of Florida. Bob enjoys hiking, dancing, cold plunging, and general merrymaking, which is a part of this podcast today. Please welcome the incredibly multifaceted, knowledgeable, inspiring, and flexible Dr. Bob Swoap. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you, Dana. What a nice introduction. Thank you. Great to be here.
Oh, Bob, I'm so glad that our paths have crossed last month at the Art and Science of Health Promotion Conference. I'm so glad you're here. And first off, before we get into how we met, I just want to say you're in the Asheville, North Carolina area, right?
That's right.
I love Asheville. I've only been a handful of times, but it is such a fun town. Lots of breweries for those drinking enthusiasts, lots of breweries, lots of great places to eat, barbecue. Oh, it's such a good area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Love it here.
How long have you been there for?
Since the late 90s. Yeah. My wife and I came to take jobs at the college, Warren Wilson College, and have stayed here ever since, raised our kids here, and loved the nature. It's surrounded by the Blue Ridge Mountains. So Asheville is in a valley, but the mountains around are just so lovely. So there's a lot of playgrounds within Asheville itself and then the surrounding area.
I like that. Natural playgrounds to
Mhm.
explore and discover in. My husband and I actually went there our first anniversary. We did a little long weekend in Asheville to explore, and we ate a
Wow.
lot of food. We ate too much food, and I think ended up going to bed early. Like it was such a kind of a not expected anniversary trip because we just gorged ourselves with too much. And then we're like, well, we're tired. Let's go to sleep. So, Bob, for our listeners, we met at the Art and Science of Health Promotion Conference, which was in April 2024 in Hilton Head, South Carolina. This was my third time attending the conference. Bob, how many years was this for you attending the conference?
Yeah, this is coming up on 20 years now. I had my first talk at the conference in 2006 and have come pretty regularly since. And most years I'm a speaker and somebody that offers what they call breakout sessions.
Yeah, that's awesome. I could tell you had been there a while. I hadn't seen you, I think, in the past 2 years, probably due to COVID circumstances and stuff. But I'm so glad that our paths crossed. And now your breakout session this year was unfortunately canceled, which I will say we benefited from just looking at the positive because your session was right next to our breakout room that Wednesday. And so I think people were planning to go to your session because it was really interesting topic
Mm.
on psychedelic-assisted therapies. And so then we had a full house. We had a full room for our breakout session. And then we ended up getting too loud when we did an exercise. And the conference organizer had to come in and be like, hey, you're being too loud. So we
Wow.
had to adjust, be flexible. We did a different exercise and didn't break people up into pairs for the next one. But I was like, yeah, I don't think the room would have been as big if Bob's session was going on next to ours.
Mhm.
Although your session was canceled, you were still able to lead the ecstatic dance activity session that Thursday night at the conference. And I have to tell you, this was one of my favorite parts of the conference. Now, I love all the research and the breakout sessions and the academic stuff, but this activity session was really special, and I will always remember it. And so after it happened, I was like, oh my God, we just improvised dance for an hour. Like, I have to have you come on the show and
Mhm.
talk about this. So I'm so glad you're here. For those who are not aware of what ecstatic dance is, what is it and how do you do it?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking about that. It was really fun to co-create that space at the conference, and it was the first time that they had that activity. That conference has a lot of wellness activities like yoga or nature walks.
Mm-hmm.
And I spoke with the organizers last year and told them about the ecstatic dance possibility, and they were all in. And so it was really fun. It's an old tradition of dancing for freedom of expression is really what it is. And it's done within community. So it's not an isolated dance. We do it in a community setting. We create a container that hopefully feels safe and inviting and fun and welcoming. And then you either have a live DJ who's mixing the dance right there and then, or like I did, I created a mix ahead of time and played it. And then that way I could dance as well, which I really like to do. And yeah, you basically invite people in and you create an intention for the dance. It's different than most social dances. So if you go to a club, it's loud, there's a lot of alcohol, and this is considered to be a substance-free space. It's really a non-conversational space once the dance gets started. And it doesn't mean it's non-communicative, though, because people will make eye contact, smile with each other, connect. They may make sounds, yell, laugh, scream, cry, whatever. And basically, it's a way to move through freedom of expression. For a lot of people, it can be really healing and transformative. And again, it goes back millennia and has iterations all around the world. So different cultures have different names for it. And it was probably around 1970 that a dancer named Gabrielle Roth recoined or recollected the term ecstatic dance, which that word comes out of the Greek ekstasis, which basically means outside of oneself, like standing outside of oneself. So the idea is really that in an improvisational way, you are responding to the music and to the flow of the community and trying to get out of your head, which is
Yes.
challenging for a lot of people because
Yes.
most people have developed shame parts around dancing as adults and feel like they're going to do it wrong. They're going to look silly. They're going to feel silly. So it ends up being a really beautiful practice in like allowing for space for yourself to express freely and play with that interplay between the mind and the body, because the mind is always making judgments about what the body's doing. And the
Yeah.
other thing is that it's exercise. So like by the end,
Yeah.
you will have worked up a sweat. So it has a lot of benefits in addition to the traditional benefits of trying to create community through song, music, and dance.
We danced for an hour for this activity session. Is that common? It's usually an hour, or it can vary in times?
It definitely can vary. I would say most ecstatic dance groups that I've been around are between an hour and a half.
Oh.
Much beyond that. And then you've got a little bit of a different flavor of it where people will be taking lots of breaks and then coming in and out. But a closed container ecstatic dance is where the music will often start off slowly and build and let people get the feel of it. And then gradually the music will increase in intensity and in beat and volume. And then on the backside, it starts to come back down more lyrically to the point at the end. Usually most people are lying on the ground in a savasana pose, like in yoga.
Mm-hmm.
And then they come back together in a circle. So it's best, we think, to keep that around between an hour to 75 minutes. And it helps people fully integrate that session without it overextending them, either physically or psychologically.
And you did, at our session at least, you did a little debrief period. First, in the beginning, you set the safety, here's how it's going to work. And then at the end, you invited everyone to sit and share if anything came up. Is that common too, to happen with the dance space?
It is. So at the opening circle, you're setting intentions. You're talking about consent, which is something that you can practice on the dance floor. And that means consent if you want to dance with another person. Since it's a non-verbal space or a non-conversational space, you have to understand if somebody wants to dance with you or not. And also, you don't have to dance with other people. So many people will just dance by themselves and go internal, almost get into a trance state. I don't know if you've ever seen the whirling dervishes who practice over in the Middle East, like in Turkey, and they'll spin for an hour consecutively to the music. And it's very much about achieving a trance-like state. So there's some people that use ecstatic dance as a way to get into that mode and again, get out of that mind consciousness and more into the like full body consciousness. So you set the opening stage and the agreements. And then in the end, the closing circle can be really sweet because it's optional, but people can share their own experience. And that's often where you'll hear people, especially if you have a group that's been ongoing for a while and they begin to know each other, that you'll begin to see a lot of conversation around healing and transformation that occurred within the dance itself. And oftentimes the most powerful part of the dance is the closing circle.
I can speak from my experience just doing it once for the first time last month at the conference. I felt so free afterwards. Like, one, it was a great workout, and I was 6 months pregnant at the time of doing it. So I still felt like I could move. Being pregnant, I am limited in my movements. Like, my body doesn't move the same as it used to. But I wasn't really in my head thinking about that. I just moved the way that my body could and the way that my body wanted to. And I remember being in it in the first 20 minutes or so, the judgment's still there. Like, we're warming up. And I wanted to move around the room. And we had a pretty good sized space for us. And I would say we probably had 20 to 30 people who showed up and tried it out. And I wanted to move about the space, but there weren't many other people who were doing that. People, in my mind, resigned themselves to a little imaginary box. But what you're saying, they were getting in a trance state and they were enjoying themselves where they were. After about 20 minutes, I let go of that judgment, that release of I'm the only one moving around, like I feel weird. And I just started enjoying myself and I didn't really care what anyone else was doing because I was just so in tune with the music and my body and the flow. And that takes a special release of just letting go and being
Yeah.
like, okay, this isn't working out the way that I expected it to. And that's still beautiful. Like this whole moment is just beautiful because everyone is doing exactly what they want to do right now. And I thought that was so cool.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. That's a great share about what your experience was. And then the people who stayed within their sort of their own little self-defined area, they may have been really comfortable in that space, or because it was new to them, they might have felt like, oh, I wish I could have walked around more or danced around more, but felt a little restricted just by their own psychology. But the thing about ecstatic dance is it's all welcome. Like you don't even have to dance.
Yeah.
There were some people that were lying on the floor near the speaker just to feel the bass. And so it's all welcome. And all shapes, all body sizes, all levels of ability. It's very much an inclusive community, which I also really like. So you can really go at whatever level you want to go. And so as you felt more free and got out of the self-judgment, you're really exploring that relationship with your brain, which is something that we do a lot anyway. Like, I think it's the same in public speaking or any form of like improv comedy. Like the second you start getting into your head and judging what you're doing, it really messes up the flow. And we know from research about flow states that when people get into that, it's usually the commentary in their brain quiets pretty significantly and they become fully immersed in the activity, which is, I think, what I saw happening with you and some of the others that were really dropping into it.
I loved it. So I'm a big flailer, Flailer. Like when I go to weddings, which I have not been invited to many weddings recently, I think a lot of my friends are now having babies or unfortunately getting divorced. I'm in that stage of life. But when I go to weddings, like I'm on the dance floor, I'm flailing around. Like I need a lot of space. At my own wedding, I stayed on the dance floor and I ended up elbowing one of my cousins. I felt so bad. They got a little too close. I need a full arm's length of space. Otherwise you're going to get hit. And what I loved about this was I could just be in full flail mode. I have no dance experience, no training. And yet I didn't need to. Like the great part about ecstatic dance is, well, I say the great part, but also the intimidating part for a lot of people is there are no steps. There's no choreo. There's no instructor leading it. You literally have to just listen to your body and free flow, which I love. But I get that for some, that can be a harder task and ask of them to do. So I just enjoyed it so much. I want to explore it after baby comes. I'm sure this is happening in LA. It's got to be happening everywhere. How did you get into this, doing it yourself?
Yeah, so I was invited by a friend who thought it would be something I would enjoy. And my wife and I had danced in many settings, but more in the choreographed way. Like we had taken ballroom dancing together, we had taken Latin dancing. And I don't fashion myself a dancer by any means in terms of having any professional qualities, but we've always loved dance, whether it's dancing with each other or going to like the Wortham Performing Arts Center here in Asheville has a beautiful set of dance activities that they bring in. It's just always been a part of my life. And at one point, a friend said, I think you should try this. I think you would like it. And the name really intimidated me. I was like, ecstatic dance, that seems like a lot of pressure. I have to get ecstatic.
It does.
Like, how am I supposed to do this? And so honestly, I was terrified. I was shaking on the side before the first time I ever did. I still remember that. And it took some time to really let go of that self-judgment and get into the flow and feel what my particular rhythm is. I was also exposed to another form of it, which is called 5 rhythms, which is the basis for a lot of ecstatic dances. It's a particular type of ecstatic dance. And if your listeners are interested, you could just look it up by typing the number 5 and then rhythms. And many communities have 5 rhythms, dances, and instructors in their town. And it's not so much that it's choreographed, but you do have more guidance. So when you came to my dance, once the music started, there was no more guidance. There was just music and flow and fun and energy, etc. With 5 rhythms, the facilitator will often speak using the microphone at parts during the dance to remind you to stay in your body and how to breathe. And so it's a little bit more guided, a little bit more structured. And then the 5 rhythms take you through 5 specific rhythms within the dance. And so it starts off flowy and then moves to staccato and then to chaos and then to lyrical and then to stillness. And it's just like a wave. And so many of us who DJ ecstatic dance have patterned ourselves after 5 rhythms, but don't necessarily use the guidance. But that's a really nice way to enter into it. And so people can find both 5 rhythms and ecstatic dance in pretty much any major city in the world. So just before we were talking today, I just Googled like Sydney ecstatic dance, Berlin ecstatic dance, San Jose ecstatic dance, Seattle, and they all pop up. There wasn't a city that didn't have it. Now, smaller towns probably don't, but you could potentially start one. Asheville itself is sort of a mecca for it. So even though we're not a very large town, we have at least 4 to 5 different ecstatic dance groups. So you can dance almost every night here with a different group.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah. So yeah, I got into it that way. And then once I learned it and felt more comfortable, I got hooked. And then the pandemic hit. And as a professor of health psychology, I began to wonder, like, how can we help our students who were becoming more depressed, more isolated? They were behind screens. They were having to voluntarily isolate or mandatorily isolate on exposure. And this was a horrible time for many students. So I have twins who are graduating this year from college.
Oh my gosh.
And
Wow.
so they started the fall of their freshman year was at the height of COVID in the fall of 2020. And that's when I started thinking about what can we do to help these students. And we came up with the idea of bringing ecstatic dance to campus and doing only outside dances so that people could feel safe. We could keep distance. We had enough space to be 6 feet apart. Some people danced with masks, but it wasn't required. But anyway, it became a wellness activity for the students. And it fit within our wellness arm of the college. We have a wellness crew and a wellness supervisor. And they felt like this would be a really helpful aspect of a student's undergraduate experience during this really difficult times. And then it's kept on going. So the students have co-created this community in which most Friday nights we have a dance on campus. And most of the nights I do the DJing, but we also bring in outside DJs and we sometimes partner with some of the other Asheville groups who come to campus. And it's really become a beautiful community.
So do you do DJing on the side or DJing as a part of ecstatic dance only? How did you get into DJing and curating these playlists?
Pretty much just through ecstatic dance. So I don't do
cool.
I don't do any DJing at clubs, although I would love to.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Yeah. So currently I just do it for ecstatic dance and I didn't have any experience with it, but having 3 kids that all loved music and I loved music, we all just played around with it. And I learned a lot about music from my kids, actually, in terms of what were some of the really fun beats. And so I spend a lot of time, you can ask my wife, walking around with these headphones in my house, listening to new music. And it's great because I don't really play a lot of old music. Sometimes you'll get a remix of a song. We had a remix of a Led Zeppelin song that was mixed with some cellos. So a lot of times you can play a song that people will recognize, but it'll be out of context. And so it's surprising. But a lot of the music is also, most of it, I would say, is non-lyrical. There aren't lyrics with it. So a lot of it is like indigenous music, tribal beats, world beats, fusion. But I'd like to have lyrics as well. So you'll hear some hip hop thrown in, maybe some old classic rock tunes, but not too many of those. Because you don't want people to get into the mode of, oh, we're now at a concert.
Right.
So there's a delicate balance of keeping them internal and connected to the community, and not so listening to the music that they're thinking, oh, yes, this is my favorite song. So it's a real balance, and I've just played with it, and I spend a lot of time making playlists and curating playlists.
Okay, I also have to ask you, you had this fancy light up cube system going on. Is that
Right.
just something you added as part of ecstatic dance? Would people see that in other places, or that's your own personal flair?
That's my own personal flair that I drew from a musician friend of mine who does sound healing. And I saw him with one of these at one of his sound healing sessions. And it's called the Hypercube.
Yeah.
And it's basically infinity mirrors with all sorts of lights. So at the last dance that I did, I had two students that got tired of dancing and they just sat by the cube and looked in the mirrors, I would say for at least 10 to 15 minutes. And it's a way to trip without actually taking any drugs. So
That's so fun.
it's really, it's my own thing. And then like many people who facilitate ecstatic dance will create a front piece. Some people call it an altar, but it would be an area where people can go to ground themselves, and they might see some stones that they like, or you can put whatever you want up there. I try to keep it relatively simple. And then we do have lights. So the lights help illuminate the setting that we're in just to make it feel more fun and playful. And you're really trying to create an atmosphere where people feel very welcome.
One thing that I'm just remembering now as we're talking is, as I was in the experience, I am an improviser. I like to be on stage and take a lot of classes, still working on my skills as a comedic improviser, but I feel comfortable calling myself an improviser now. But one of the things I struggle with on stage a lot is my space work. So like working with imaginary objects, like I'm holding a can right now and I'm going to drink from the can. But when we were dancing, I visualized a ton of props and movements that involved like holding things. At one point, I think I had a balloon that I was like hitting back and forth and like playing with myself just in this balloon. And after, I was like, oh, I can do space work. Like I've just been limiting myself that I can't, but like my brain can form the space to hold these objects. And I probably get nervous on stage in front of other people. So I was very free in that moment to just hold these imaginary objects and really play with them. I loved that.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you found that. That's great. And another form of improv that you can practice that's really fun is mirroring, which is something that's done in improv. So, and it's also done in modern dance. Modern dancers mirror each other all the time. And sometimes they physically touch and sometimes they don't. And that's also true in ecstatic dance. If you physically touch, you have to be really clear about consent again. But even mirroring, you're entering into that person's space. So if they're willing to do that with you, then you're tracking each other's movements. And the nicest experience of that is when it's a flow between, you don't even know who's leading and who's following anymore.
Yes.
And so there isn't a sense of anything choreographed, and the two of you almost instinctually make similar moves. And sometimes it can be around like a playful object. I've seen people like pretend that they're like digging something together and then pulling something out of the ground and then like raising it to the skies. And I don't know what moved them to do that, but they did it. And it's really fun to watch. And you can see people becoming very playful with their imagination and improvising with that.
I do remember mirroring with a few participants in the session. My friend Tina joined, and I remember dancing with her a little bit. And then I had some movements with you too. I think at one point we were like locked in arms and then about to spin around the dance floor. And at first I was like, oh, this is so fun. And then I think my mind kicked in and like, hey, by the way, you probably shouldn't do a ton of spins, just for safety. Right. So I did call that off. So a little bit of the mind was still at play there for safety purposes, but it's fun, like the way that it just got there naturally. Like it wasn't forced. It's just what happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Beautiful.
Well, and it reminded me a lot of, I've been taking some clown classes on the side, like just one-off clown classes. Clowning's becoming a big thing, like kind of one step up of improv, just in freedom on stage and in space and stuff. And so there's an instructor who will run these monthly clown workshops. And how she does her warm-ups is there's probably, again, like 20 to 30 people in this large room. She'll play a song or two and she'll be like, now dance around, free flow dance. She doesn't call it ecstatic dance. We free flow dance. And then she'll give us little things, little character tidbits. So she'll say, oh, both of your parents were modern dancers. So let that inform how you move. Now you have 20 years of mime training and let that inform how you move in the dance. So it's not exactly ecstatic dance, but it's still a piece of that freedom flow. And it reminded me a lot of that. And so when I'm in the clown workshops, I'm surrounded by people who are there for the same reasons. So we're all pretty extroverted in the sense of everyone's moving and there's no real judgment there. But to see it happen in the public health space, like public health professionals space at a conference, no less, I think that speaks volumes to this work and the benefits. And just every conference could offer it. Like, it was very powerful.
Yeah, I was really thrilled that they included that. And it feels right too. I mean, there's a good amount of research on dance itself as being a powerful, if you will, intervention for psychological distress issues. So it's one of the more powerful treatments that we have, along exercise as a treatment for depression, say. So if you ask people to engage in exercise for treatment of depression, one of the issues you get is compliance, is with, do people really want to do 3 days a week on a treadmill for 45 minutes at 60 to 80% of VO2 max? But if you say, hey, we've got this dance and we're going to create a safe container, it's going to be fun, you're not having anybody track their heart rate, it's just naturally going to get up for the right amount of time at an aerobic intensity. So anyway, the research is pretty clear that dance is a powerful intervention when it's used even in clinical studies. So in this naturalistic setting of ecstatic dance, there has been very little research, although I had 2 students just complete a research study this semester on looking at the benefits of ecstatic dance. And so hopefully they're going to write that up and publish it. But the things that I hear go well beyond, oh, I got a good workout, although that's a part of it. More of it are things like people will say, this is the only time I feel safe in my body.
Wow.
This is the only time that I don't engage in body shaming of myself. This is the only time I feel accepted and seen for who I am, what I look like, how I move, and I know I'm not being judged. And that's a powerful healer for people that have experienced all sorts of trauma in a society that overvalues looks and thin bodies, etc. So to me, it's a natural for a health promotion and wellness activity and conference. And if we can get everybody to buy into it, it doesn't mean everybody has to do ecstatic dance, but some form of practice in which they begin to let go of some of the judgment of themselves, that can be really powerful. I've also had students say things like, my grandfather died last year and I danced with him tonight. I brought him with me. And that's partially the music's designed sometimes to do that. We'll have specific themes and invitations around like grief or joy or letting go. And the curation of the music is designed to help people access a range of emotions. So it's not uncommon to see people who go through the range of emotions while they're dancing. It can be really fun, but it can also be challenging. And some people will spend some time crying. And we just let it all happen. If somebody needs help, we can go help them. But many times they just need to work through it and feel witnessed in it. And then in the closing circle, they'll share about it. And for me, again, as a facilitator, particularly of young people going through this, that can be the most powerful part of it.
Okay, I have chills from that story, that anecdote of someone dancing with the grandfather or a person who just passed away. Oh my gosh, like how powerful. Ugh. Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah. And it actually intersects with another area that I think you might want to ask me about, but I might jump to that now if that's okay.
Please do, jump away. Let's go.
Well, I was just thinking about the part about dancing with grief. And so one of the groups that I work with in Asheville is called the Center for Conscious Living and Dying, which is the CCLD. And it's a care home that is staffed almost 100% by volunteers who go through end-of-life doula training, basically.
Wow.
And we care for people who know they're dying and want to die in a non-medicalized setting. They can still get hospice care if they want, and they can still have medicine to help them feel less pain. But the whole aspect of dying is not medicalized, and it's seen much more as a spiritual journey surrounded by loved ones and community. And what made me think of this was that we currently have a resident who is in her final journey. And she's a dancer. And so one of the things we did when I took a turn as a volunteer was we danced. And that was really healing for her, is that she got to express herself through movement, even as she's getting ready to die. And so it's really empowering for the person who's going through that journey. And then for anybody that's witnessing it as well, because it becomes like this gift of seeing people not as like dying people, but as alive people who are just moving towards their death. And so we've done several ecstatic dances as fundraisers for the CCLD. And
Wow.
many of the volunteers have come over who have never done it before. And sometimes the themes are about like transitions, dealing with grief. And so I sometimes think ecstatic dance, that the title is a little limiting, honestly. I think it's more like conscious dance is what it is, or conscious community dance. Because it's not just about being ecstatic. That happens, but it's mostly about being with what's present.
Okay. Well, the hormones, these pregnancy hormones are real, because I'm tearing up a bit just at the power of the emotions and like this art form and expressive arts in general, and just how it can help heal. Gosh, it's beautiful. And I was very sports oriented. I talk about this in a lot of episodes, but I was very sports oriented growing up. And so dance just wasn't really dance and arts just wasn't really my thing. And now as I've gotten older and realizing like anyone can do this. Yes, they're really talented people up on stage making a living, but like anyone can do this. They can do the ecstatic conscious dance. They can do an improv class. They can do these expressive arts that just open them up and let go of the perfection and the judgment. And it is really, not to be dramatic, it is life-changing when you embrace those skills.
Yeah, and I think the more venues you can do it in, the more you get practice with being playful with your own self.
Yeah.
And that just helps you, again, turn off that judging part. So we actually have somebody that leads improv classes for the volunteers at the Center for Conscious Living and Dying.
Yes.
And they just had a big, I guess, performance once they had practiced it for a while about how to be in presence with each other. And so they're inside laughing and hooting it up. And on the outside, we're with that woman who is towards her end of her life. And she's at this sacred fire. And everything is being held, all of it, all of the emotions, the range of experiences. And you're right, there is no limit on the age. And in fact, you'll see people that dance regularly often stay more flexible physically, psychologically, emotionally. And so many people who come to these ecstatic conscious dances are in their 70s and 80s.
So beautiful. I want to switch a little bit because we're talking about a substance-free space where you dance and just let go of the mind and let the body take over. But on the flip side, your research also deals with psychedelic-assisted therapies, which is a pretty hot topic, also a taboo topic for some, for many. So I know this is a very general question, but I know you're able to talk about it. I mean, tell us more about your research in psychedelic-assisted therapies and what are you seeing in this field?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So as a clinical psychologist, I've been acutely aware of the rise in anxiety and depression really for many years now, probably at least the last 15, that we see pretty significant increases in all of this. And we continue to struggle, I think, as a field in psychology and psychiatry to help people manage mental health challenges. And so I've kept my eye on what's happening in the psychedelic-assisted therapy field, which had its heyday back in the 50s and 60s and then got shut down in 1970 by Richard Nixon. And then the research started again in the late 90s, early 2000s. And you just began to notice that there were studies that were showing really significant impact of people who experience psychedelic therapy held in the right sort of setting, which is with trained therapists, with the right type of music, the right type of medicine, et cetera. And so this involves a lot of different substances, some of which are still Schedule 1 drugs, for example, psilocybin or MDMA. You know, if you're here in North Carolina, you don't have access to that unless you go to a clinical trial. But there is one medicine that is legal now that's used in psychedelic-assisted therapy, which is ketamine. And so that's the medicine that I've been able to study as a researcher because it is legal. And it's used in all 50 states and in Canada. And so there are a lot of clinics that are using ketamine primarily to help people with treatment of depression. And so I got really interested in it from a perspective of, are we doing the best we can to offer this medicine in a way that's accessible to a lot of people? And so I was particularly interested in the model that involves group administration of ketamine and then group psychotherapy because of the power of the group. You can see that as a theme for me, like the group of dancers, groups of students, like it's the power of community that's often very healing. And so I partnered with a group in the area that does something called group CAP. So CAP stands for ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. And this group CAP is a specific model in which people come together for a series of workshops on Saturdays. And part of the morning is done with setting intentions. Part of it is taking the medicine under supervision. Every person that gets that medicine has to be medically cleared, screened, et cetera. And then there is like a journey that happens with that ketamine that is a sort of a psychedelic journey in which one begins to have a sense of dissociation, a sense of less ego involved. You might get insights. People have a lot of different experiences with it. And then once the medicine journey is over in the afternoon, there's integration. So people will eat together, they'll go into nature together, they'll play music together, they'll do artwork together. Now, this is one model. There's other models that don't follow this at all. But I really liked this model and I wanted to see, and so did the guy who created it, what is the impact here? So we began to give each person who was willing, who agreed and completed informed consent, like pre-post measures of things like depression, stress, anxiety. And then also another measure that looks at something called self-leadership, which is the ability to live your life from a self-led place instead of being jerked around by parts of ourselves, like an angry part or a shame part or a judging part. We live more like from a core self, which might be compassionate, kind, clear, courageous. So that measure is called the self-leadership scale. And that's the article that I published in January. It's in the American Journal of Health Promotion. And it's a reflection on that study. And in addition to me crunching the numbers, I also was a participant as a sort of a patient in it myself, because I had never done that medicine before. And I wanted to see, well, what is it like to be on the receiving end of all this care and so forth? So I was a participant. The other participants in the group knew who I was. It wasn't hidden. I was clearly a participant, observer, researcher. And then we did interviews with them and we've done follow-up. I just had a student finish her capstone thesis this semester, and she was interviewing people who have continued to do this and looking at long-term follow-up. And what we're finding is really dramatic shifts in psychological functioning that appear to be long-lasting. And we can't say that with any confidence yet, but the direction seems to point to the fact that there are long-term benefits here. But the acute benefits are clear. People are having rates of drops in depression and anxiety and stress on the order of 67%, which is much higher than like standard care, say a typical SSRI antidepressant. And I'm not a medical doctor, so I'm not advising people to jump off SSRIs and go to a ketamine clinic.
Of course.
If it's something that you're interested in, then there's a lot of data out there that suggests that this is helpful. And in context with your podcast and improv, I think there is some improv that's going on here, which is that when you are in that state, you're dealing with your mind in a very different way than you normally do. Mm-hmm. And so you can be playful with it. You can, like, sometimes the visions just come and you don't have a lot of control over those. And other times you can say, have an intention, I want to work on a conflict that I'm having with my partner, or I want to work on a trauma that I experienced. And if it's done intentionally and the set and setting are held well, and the people that I studied were both therapists that were holding the space for all the participants. So they had the ability to process whatever was coming up in these participants. This is quite different, say, than just going out and taking mushrooms in a field with somebody.
Or
which may be
ayahuasca or
or ayahuasca, and that may be healing and transformative too. But
yeah.
all the clinical trials are done, and all the evidence-based material is really in these pretty controlled settings in which the facilitators are trained therapists and are usually trauma informed. They know how to treat depression, and they should have some ability to understand what it's like to navigate psychedelic space, because
Hmm.
it is a non-ordinary state of consciousness. And if you're not familiar with it, it can be scary. And ketamine in itself is like a dissociative anesthetic. So you can have all sorts of bodily sensations that can be both pleasant, but can also be off-putting if you're not ready for it.
Well, I was going to ask, in those spaces, the Saturday spaces you were talking about, did anyone experience, and not to get, of course, aggregate, of course, yeah, but did anyone experience any like negative or bad trips kind of thing? Or was it mostly positive, or it's always personal, right?
It's definitely personal. So each journey or trip is different for each person. And some of it is dose related because you can take a different dose depending on what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
So, for example, if I provide ketamine assisted psychotherapy to somebody, I might use a very low dose so that they actually don't experience a psychedelic component at all. They just have what's called a psycholytic experience. And that allows them to still have a conversation, but they have a little bit of detachment from these noisy parts up in the head that get in the way of us talking about things that are challenging. But on the higher doses, people have all sorts of experiences. And so in the aggregate, I would say the majority of them were positive experiences. And even the ones that were challenging, if they're held well and processed well, can be very positive. So usually if somebody talks about a bad trip, in my experience as a researcher and clinician, that's usually because the set and setting were not held well. And
Mm.
the person spins out but doesn't have support. But if they've got all the support and they're in the right space, they can have really challenging experiences and learn a ton from that. So, I don't want to speak about other people, but I can speak about myself because on one of my experiences as a participant, I took too high of a dose
Oh,
and I didn't know it.
yeah.
and and the next thing I knew, I was experiencing symptoms that were very scary. And I don't know, I probably had the sense that I was dying. And
Wow.
yeah,
Er,
and I had this thought in my head as I was going through this. My wife is going to kill me that I've killed myself. She's going to be so mad. And then the next thing I knew, like both of the facilitators were with me, just like providing the support to help me bring me out of that really challenging, scary part. And then the therapeutic part was I then began to experience a lot of shame because here I was, the researcher, the clinician, the person that probably should have known better about taking that high of a dose, et cetera. And so I was telling the main facilitator, like, I am so sorry I messed up and blah, blah, blah. And he just held it all. And then later we worked with it using a type of therapy called internal family systems and helped me process those parts of myself that were feeling a lot of shame. And it turns out that it ends up being really important because most of us carry shame parts and we don't like them very much because they don't make us feel good.
no.
And so when they come up, if you don't know what to do with them, you're going to do other things like you might overeat, you might go scroll through Instagram or watch TV so that you don't feel bad. So in that therapy, and this is the key to good psychedelic assisted therapy, is the integration, is that in that moment, then a good facilitator can help you process what you experienced. And IFS, internal family systems, partners really well with psychedelic assisted therapy because in that type of journey, you often become much more clear on the parts that you have within you. And it doesn't become pathological. It's not, oh my gosh, I have multiple personality disorder. It's just, I exist as a person of multitudes. And like, I want to be in charge. Like, I want to be
Mhm.
heart led and led from my core. But sometimes I'm jerked around by my anger or my judging part or my fearful part. And I need to recognize that. And that's where that therapy and that integration can help you make sense of what happened in that journey experience.
Thank you for sharing your personal experience too. I know we're laughing about the thoughts that were coming up. I can imagine that they were very scary in that moment and terrifying, and thoughts that you might not have had. So it's wonderful that you had the support around you to help you cope and process what was coming up. I wanted to ask about you said like the acute findings you're seeing is about a 67% drop in depression, anxiety, mental health kind of symptoms. And is that in one session or is that kind of a series? How are these Saturday sessions run and set up for the participants?
Yeah, so this particular group does it in two ways. One of them, in the group that I was with, does it for 4 consecutive Saturdays. So you get 4 administrations of the medicine 1 week apart with integrative sessions in between each of those Saturdays. So you have 8 full therapy sessions, basically. They also have a version of it for people that are out of town and want to come and try this, but don't have a month to give up. So they would come and they would maybe rent an Airbnb or something. And then they do that, say, on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and they do the integration on those days. And so it would be called an intensive. And we aggregated both sets of those data. We didn't differentiate. We just looked at anybody that was pre and post. So some people, it was only a week later, and some people it was a month or 5 weeks later. And so on average, we had these pretty dramatic drops. What's really interesting and even more amazing about those data are that we didn't have as a requirement that a person had to meet clinical criteria to be depressed. So within these subjects, within these participants, we had some people that were probably not scoring all that high on depression, and we were still seeing dramatic drops. So if you were just to look at people who met clinical criteria for, say, post-traumatic stress disorder or generalized anxiety disorder or social anxiety or major depression disorder that's treatment resistant, we probably would see even larger drops. And the big question to me and research is like, how long does this extend? And do you need to continue to do ketamine like booster sessions? And we just don't have the data at this point to speak very clearly about that.
It's coming, though. I mean, there's so many questions to do research on and find out. And certainly you don't get just like conclusive evidence, but you can draw some ideas from the research that suggests that these can help. And yeah, I'm curious more like on a one-time session too. You hear of these like weekend retreats. People go out and take these substances and it's a very powerful experience. So is that one-time experience, of course, beneficial, but like the lasting effects versus a 4-week series, a month-long series, and the time dose relationship too.
Yes, and what you're learning in those integration sessions. So if you've got 4 2-hour integration sessions using a particular type of therapy that works well with this, that's a lot more than going on a weekend retreat and then maybe having one follow-up call with an integration coach. Now, we are also still seeing pretty strong benefits from those weekend retreats. And sometimes, for example, psilocybin, the magic mushrooms, you don't usually see people doing those once a week because they're much bigger experiences for most people than ketamine. Ketamine is short acting. It has a half-life that's much shorter than psilocybin. So if you engage in a psilocybin treatment, you're usually talking about 1, 2, maybe 3 times over the course of many months. And much of that research comes out of some of the major universities that have access to doing clinical trials with psilocybin, for example, Johns Hopkins or Imperial College of London or NYU. And they are really showing, again, powerful impact on things like things that you wouldn't even guess, like smoking cessation. Like people that engage in psilocybin treatment have much higher successful rates of quitting smoking than they do with other methods, which puzzles a lot of people. They're like, wait a minute, we're using a substance to treat a substance addiction.
Right.
And one of the risks of ketamine is that you can get addicted to it because it's a medicine that impacts some of your opioid receptors, which makes it more addictive. But psilocybin and LSD, you're much less likely to get addicted to those. They have very good safety profiles. So if they're done in the right context, you may only need to do it once or twice or 3 times. And then what we think the mechanism of change is there is probably a combination of neurobiological. For example, you develop more neuroplasticity when you take these medicines, meaning that you can learn new things more easily. But the other thing is that people will often talk about a mystical experience that they have on these medicines to the point that they will say things like, this experience is one of the top 5 experiences of my life. Like, I had insights in this experience that I'd never had before. And I realized, for example, why I'm addicted to cigarettes, or how I can let go of some of my fears. And there are case reports of people who will do a medicine journey like this and then instantly quit drinking, or instantly make reparations with their family. End of life anxiety is a big one too. We've seen really big changes with that. People who get terminal cancer diagnoses and then undergo psilocybin treatment will often come to much clearer terms of peace with their own death. And so those are avenues that the research world is pursuing, and it's an exciting time for the field.
Very exciting. I know there's a lot of stigma around this kind of thing. You mentioned after the 70s, we're making up, researchers and people are making up for a lot of lost time between probably the 20 years that the stigma was happening. I went through the DARE program in the 90s, right? And so for those who are listening and still have that mindset of how can you do this? Like, I'm sure there's a lot of differing opinions out there. You mentioned there are some risk factors, being addicted. And then also, I would imagine someone who goes through this process and has this experience, then they might be dependent on, like, something's come up. I need to have this therapy session again. I need to go through this whole month journey again, where it's no,
Right.
maybe you have the tools now to cope better. But what are some of the other risk factors involved, and how does this research mitigate those risk factors?
Yeah, great question. And I think for any listener who is skeptical, I would say, great. I'm glad you are. Like, I encourage you to be skeptical. And skepticism is different than cynicism. Cynicism says it's all garbage, it's all drugs. Why would you ever do that? Skeptical says, show me the evidence, and I'm not convinced about this. And really, even though we're finding a lot of positive benefits, the trials are still relatively small. So in terms of numbers. And so I think a healthy dose of skepticism is good to see what are we finding, what needs to be done more. And then if you're concerned about it yourself, to get a ketamine prescription now, you need to be medically screened. There are some medical factors that would potentially rule you out. And so anybody that's interested in doing this type of work should always talk with their most trusted healthcare professional to see, does this feel like a good match for you? And what are the physical risk factors? I'm a PhD clinical psychologist, so I don't usually, I can talk to clients about that, but I usually say, please talk to the person who knows your medical history. So I'm working with an older adult right now who has had a heart history, and that could be a potential risk factor. So we've just titrated the dose much lower. And for people that are high risk, you can do it in medical clinics where you can get, for example, a ketamine IV or a ketamine intramuscular injection. So it's more intense, but it's also staffed more with medical personnel. So I would say, look at what your potential risk factors are. And again, most of the medicines that people are looking at right now don't have particularly a bad safety profile, especially around addiction. Ketamine is one of the exceptions. And I think we're actually going to see some problems with it because it's probably too easily prescribed right now. And people can get at-home prescriptions of it. And if they're not monitored closely, or they're not able to monitor themselves closely, you can see people beginning to take more of the medicine and more frequently. So that comes with its own set of side effects, including risks to the bladder. And in addition to just becoming addicted to the substance as just another substance that helps you feel better. So that's the one, even it's the legal one, it's the one that I think carries probably right now, I would say, the highest risk. And so I would encourage anybody that's interested in this from a perspective of, I have a family member that I think who's had treatment-resistant depression. They don't respond well to their SSRIs. They've never responded well to psychotherapy. It might be something to look at and just enter into it carefully and with asking a lot of good questions.
So fascinating. And I hope, and I imagine we'll see more research coming out of this field. Now, this is only one subset of your research that you do. You also have health psychology research, mindfulness research, focusing a lot on mindfulness with college students. So why have you chosen college students as your kind of subject matter?
Well, for a lot of reasons. One is that They are a group that is under a lot of stress, and they are at the intersection of all of these competing forces, like people asking them to pay attention closely to learn and for them to navigate their social environment and to work and meet their financial needs and to understand diversity and to look at what's happening in the world and see the conflict in the Middle East. And so there's just so much going on for young people that I think being able to learn how to be mindfully present with themselves is a good tool. So a few years ago, we published a study in which we randomly assigned one group of students to mindfulness training and the other group to, I think it was just more like education. And we found a pretty big difference for those students that participated in the mindfulness in terms of the impact on their emotional resilience, their emotional stability. And also we showed an increase in retention from semester to semester. So one thing that you see with college students is that they transfer or they drop out. And so those students that were in the mindfulness group retained better to the next semester than those students who didn't. And that's a finding that I have not seen replicated anywhere, but it's an interesting one, is that it has behavioral impact. So that's one reason. Another reason is it's a population that, of course, I have access to as a professor at a college, and I have a lot of colleagues in universities. So, but I'm also committed to it. Like, I feel strongly about the power of it when it's implemented in good ways. It creates more psychological flexibility, which I think relates to people who are trying to publicly speak or do improv in their work setting. Is if you have more psychological flexibility, again, it helps just turn the volume down on that inner critic that says, oh, I didn't respond well here, or I made a mistake on my pronunciation of this particular word. And when we can turn the volume down on that, then we can get into a flow state. And that's a lot of mindfulness training is about helping you get into that flow state. So I do that with students, but I also do it with first responders. I've done a study with the Asheville Fire Department, and we've looked at the power of these types of interventions on their ability to be resilient in the face of trauma, and have found some interesting things there. And then also I do it with athletes. I work with athletes from recreational to Olympic, I think you mentioned earlier. And it's hard to imagine that there's an athlete that I've worked with in the last 10 years that I haven't included some form of training around mindfulness, which is basically the ability to pay attention in the present moment without judgment. And if you think about athletes, if they're in a competition and they make a mistake, if they start thinking about that mistake, they've now compounded it, right? Because they're no longer present. And so public speakers have the same thing. I don't know if this has happened to you, but I suspect it's happened to you. It's certainly happened to me, where you're in the middle of a speech, and then, but in your head, you're 5 minutes ago thinking about something that you said or wish you had said differently. And the time for that review is later.
Exactly.
So it's something I work with, like Division I athletes in college of all different sports. A few years ago, I got to work with the Olympic table tennis team, and concentration and focus and being able to be present in the moment is just huge for that population. And I know some of those young people that I was working with 3 or 4 years ago are now qualifying for the Summer Olympics, which are happening later this summer in Paris.
What's involved in the mindfulness training? Like, how do you, because it's one thing to just say, hey, you need to be more mindful, right? And here are some steps. So like, how do you really coach people to be more mindful?
Yeah, I teach them. So I use like empirically valid methods, sound methods of teaching this as a practice. It can be a secular practice. It does not have to be based in any spiritual belief or religious belief, although it also is consistent with spiritual and religious beliefs. But the version I teach is secular, and it largely draws from research and practitioners that have been doing this in the West for more than 50 years. And of course, the practices themselves are ancient, but turning it into a practice that you can study and teach in a standardized way, we have a lot of data that shows how to do this. So a lot of it is around education, because so many people who try to engage in mindfulness say, I can't do it because my mind's too busy.
I've heard that.
And anytime I try to meditate, I just get too distracted. And that's just a misconception about what mindfulness practice is, because that's the exact point of it, is learning how busy your mind is, and then beginning to learn how to deal with what some people call the monkey mind, which is this mind that just jumps from one thing to the next. And we live in a world that sort of is distracting anyway.
Very distracting.
We have a supercomputer we carry around in our pocket that is beeping and notifying us at all times. And so to imagine that we could stay focused on a conversation or a topic or a project without practice it's smarter to think about, like, how can I get myself to do this in a way where I become more efficient and I also feel better about it. So one of the keys of mindfulness is that when your mind wanders, you just bring it back to the present moment without any judgment. And when you learn how to do that, you really get a victory of coming back into the present moment over and over. So mindfulness really is about remembering. It's about remembering that the only moment that you actually have is this one right here. And that worrying about the future, I mean, planning for the future is okay, but worrying about it, you're getting into time travel, mental time travel. And the brain is really good at that. And the brain is a master storyteller. So teaching people how to do mindfulness is also teaching people what the brain does and why it does what it does. And so you begin to have a softer, gentler relationship with your own brain. And I think it leads to a lot of benefits. This is probably the talk that I've given the most at the Art and Science of Health Promotion, is, depending on the population I was working with, is what are the benefits of mindfulness for health, physical health, psychological health. And the data are really convincing about all the ways in which it can impact people's lives.
I needed to hear that today about planning ahead is okay, certainly, but worrying about the future is not helpful. And of course, I'm doing a lot of that right now in my motherhood journey. And I have been trying to implement some breathing techniques and just more getting centered and mindful. And some weeks I do great at it. And then other weeks I backlash. I'm like, I don't need it. I'm good. Like, I did it for a week and I felt the benefits. I don't have 5 minutes. I make up excuses. And it's like, when I actually sit down and do the mindfulness, whatever I've set as the time limit to do it, I feel so much better. And yet I have this constant battle. No, I don't need it anymore. Yes, I do. It's just make it a part of your day when you can. And also being flexible and gracious with yourself and say, okay, I got distracted. Let's come back to the present moment.
Right. Yeah. So 2 things came up for me when you said this. One was the one about you worrying about the future, which totally makes sense with what's on your horizon. But it reminds me of one of my favorite quotes around this by Mark Twain, who said, "I've had a great many troubles in my life, and most of them never happened." Yeah. So there's that. And then the other, I think, has to do with that idea of where to find time to practice. So start small, 5 minutes, where you set your phone for a timer, or you even use a guided meditation that's 5 minutes long. 5 minutes is better than 0 minutes. One of my teachers, Dan Harris, who used to be an ABC news correspondent, talks about the 1 minute mindfulness minute. And he's like, 1 minute's better than 0. And so there's also another way to think about it, which is you don't just have to do formal meditation practice. You can also just practice being mindful in your daily life. So when you're driving, are you actually driving, or are you thinking about a million things? When you're doing the dishes, could you possibly just feel what it feels like to have your hands soapy? And I'm not saying the whole time, but for part of that time, and what that's teaching your brain to do is be okay with where you are in the present moment without time traveling to the future or the past.
I'm pausing just for reflection here, because there's so much. We find ways to distract ourselves. Doing dishes, I listen to music, or I listen to my podcast to make edits and stuff. And certainly, again, you said that's okay, but 100%. Can you make the choice when you want to be mindful to just be mindful? I have started from listening to a previous guest's episode, Jay Maddock, who talked about nature. And one of the things he talked about was being more mindful in nature, and not walking with headphones, and actually letting the senses experience nature. And so when I go on my neighborhood walks, I try to do that more, even though I want to listen to my podcast episodes to make my edits, I actually say, you know what, I will benefit more from being more mindful. And I do notice a lot. I notice the colors of the flowers more. I notice the
Right.
sky. I notice the sounds. And you don't get that when you're distracted with something else.
Right. And then how do you feel after noticing the flowers and the colors and the sounds, like in being in nature? I mean, Jay would argue, and I've heard him speak about this, there's a pretty strong psychological benefit to that. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that the reason that occurs is that the brain and the body are now aligned. They're in the same place. Whereas so much of the time, the brain is not where the body is. The body is always present, but the brain is so good at not being present that misalignment is, I think, what causes us a lot of stress. And also that feeling like I've always got to be doing something. I have to be accomplishing something. So I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
listen to my podcast and make edits, or I'm going to whatever it might be. And it's not an all or nothing proposal. It's, say you go for a walk in your neighborhood for 30 minutes, maybe 10 minutes of it, you say, I'm not going to have my earbuds in, and I'm just
Yeah.
going to walk slowly, feel my feet hit the ground, and try to have what we call beginner's mind, which is, can you see the world as if you've never seen it before? And that helps to build gratefulness. It helps to build awe, which is something that one of my colleagues at UC Berkeley studies, Dr. Keltner, he would be a great guest for you.
Oh, yeah.
The study of awe and looking at the world and saying, this is an awesome place. It's awesome because everything, when you really pay attention to it closely, provides a sense of awe, whether it's the Grand Canyon or an ant making its home, or even your internal feelings. Like, that's pretty awesome itself. And so, again, it gives you a chance to, I think, cultivate some of these other things that help us thrive, which include things like gratitude, awe, feeling like one is flourishing, feeling like one is living one's
Mm-hmm.
purpose, that kind of stuff.
So, how do you relate this mindfulness techniques and then other sports psychology techniques to athletes specifically in your work with athletes?
Yeah. So if they're in front of me in my office, I will show them how to do breathing techniques that help them drop into the present moment. And then even online, we can do that too, because I work with athletes from sort of around the country and the world. But it's very much like, I consider myself like a mental coach. So they have a performance coach, they have a strength training coach, they have a nutrition
Mm-hmm.
coach. So say the table tennis team for the Olympians. I mean, they have all these coaches. So why not have a coach that also helps you deal with what goes on in the mind? And that turns out to be pretty important for all of us. And when we are trying to do things at a high level, like Olympic athletes do, it involves learning, like getting into a state of receptivity and learning, how do I employ this in my life? So like with table tennis, an example would be, what do I do the moment after I make a mistake? Do I quickly serve again because I'm embarrassed or ashamed and I don't want to think about it? Or can I take one quick breath that grounds me, recenters me, and gets me back in the moment? You know, I do that with tennis players, with golfers, because there's a lot of downtime in those sports. And that's a time for your mind to sort of run away with itself. And it's having a mindful relationship, but it's also about heartfulness too. So people can talk about mindfulness and get the idea that it's only about learning how to tame this monkey mind, but it's also learning how to create a connection between the heart and the mind, because like many of my athletes play better when they realize they're playing for a purpose that's bigger than themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that's connecting to your purpose. Like, why do you do this podcast? Why do you want to be a clown? Why do you, like those are things that are important to you. And when you align with that, again, your heart's in your body. So now you're aligning the brain and the body, the mind and the body, and you're seeing this connection and you're feeling it. So there's a wonderful meditation teacher named Jack Kornfield who talks a lot about heartfulness as being just as important as mindfulness, and that the two of those are inextricable. And learning how to like getting into your heart and giving yourself, for example, self-compassion when you make a mistake. That feels to me really important for anybody that does public speaking, anybody that interacts in their businesses with the public or with other employees, which is pretty much everybody, right? We're going to make mistakes. So how do we drop back into our hearts and not beat ourselves up over that? So a lot of athletes and clients I teach self-compassion to as well. And people struggle with that because they'll think, oh, this is just so sappy. It's so self-indulgent. Like I feel like such a baby. And it's just the opposite. By being self-compassionate, you actually become more able to be compassionate with the world. And that can only bring good things, right? Because if you're doing improv and you're connected to your audience in a more heartful way, you know how that feels. It feels like this beautiful flow.
Yes.
And that sort of circles back to ecstatic dance, is that when people have been dancing together for a while, it looks like there's this what you might call a murmuration, if you've ever seen a murmuration of birds that fly and they mirror each other, like the swallows.
Oh, yeah.
It's so cool. And they're just picking up on these tiny cues from each other. Like that in the dance world. And I think you'd probably see that in the improv world as well.
So much there. I'm thinking about my time as a coach. About 5 or 6 years ago, I coached youth volleyball, youth girls, ages 13 to 17, different years. And I really hope I get the opportunity to coach again. Maybe I'll coach my daughter, if she wants to play. Maybe I'll pick it back up. So as a coach 5 to 6 years ago, I only knew what I was taught as a player. And so I tried to imitate that and replicate that. And so when the girls would make a mistake, it would be like, brush it off, shake it off, move on to the next one. But I think there's a lot of training that needs to come with that. Like you can't just say, hey, brush it off. Or like, oh, you're getting so upset about this one mistake. Let it go. And for some people, they can. That comes natural. And then some people, it doesn't. And that's when like the trainings and we can actually dive deeper and talk about that. And I will admit that I was not doing that as a coach. I wasn't prepared. I didn't know at the time. And so I'm just thinking ahead, whether it's youth or Olympians, like everyone can benefit from that kind of heartfulness training, mindfulness training, not just saying, hey, let it go, but actually being like, here's some techniques on how to let it go.
Right. It's sort of like coaches or parents that just say, just relax out there.
Yeah. As they're yelling the whole time.
What
at
does
their
that
kid.
mean? Like, how do I relax when I feel my heart beating at 120 beats per minute as I'm getting ready to serve this volleyball for if I get a side out here, my team loses. And now you're a 15-year-old girl and you already are in a developmental stage of feeling like the world is looking at you under a microscope. So there's a developmental stage going on. And then, if you have a coach that's insensitive, that's even worse. You were actually a sensitive coach because you said, brush it off, shake it off. You may not have given them all the skills, but there are other coaches that say very different things.
Yeah.
Like,
my body may have
don't
said
make a mistake.
Exactly. I also think about like golfers specifically. You mentioned golfers, but any like high level athlete, you see the end rounds, the top 3. And if this one makes this putt, they win. And like financially on the line, they're going to make millions of dollars if they make this putt. Now, I imagine the golfers hopefully are not thinking about the financial impact, but how do you help these high level athletes, not even high level, a 15-year-old girl about to serve for game point in this high pressure way? How do you help them to manage the pressure and even thrive in the pressure?
Right. So what we basically do is teach them how to not get thrown off by the fact that they're nervous. So an old technique in sports psychology that some coaches and sports psychologists still use that is not effective in my mind and in my experience is like the power of positive thinking. So just telling somebody to think positively doesn't make sense when you're in a circumstance where you're feeling really anxious, because what's your brain going to listen to? This sort of false self-talk or this body that's heart is pounding? So the message that the person is getting is, I'm unsafe right now, right? Your heart's beating as if you were being attacked by a saber-toothed tiger. So like imagining that you could talk yourself out of that and say, oh, everything's okay, no big deal. So I do the opposite, which is I say, of course you're nervous. Like, it's important to you. You care about it. Right. And they're like, oh, it's okay for me to be nervous. I'm like, yeah, of course it's okay for you to be nervous. Now let's talk about what to do with those nerves. So too many people try to get the person not to feel nervous and not to have negative thoughts. And that to me is just the wrong approach. The right approach is teaching people how to deal with nervousness, how to deal with negative thoughts, which inevitably rise. So if you think about the number of thoughts you have in a day, you're in the thousands.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those thoughts are going to be negative, right? And your mind's going to pay attention to those because they're scary. So just imagining you can just say, oh, just don't have those thoughts, be stronger, be more mentally tough is really an illusion. And it doesn't help the athlete, I don't think, or the firefighter or the parent. It's not just about athletes. It's about having a gentler relationship with your own thoughts when they do come up and they are negative. It's, oh, this is just one of those 1,000 thoughts that come up over and over again. And I don't have to latch onto it. I can acknowledge it and I can let it go like any of the other thoughts. So it makes sense if I give you an example. So I worked with a runner a few years ago he was the editor of Runner's World. And so he was a good runner, but not an elite runner. And he was really struggling with qualifying for the Boston Marathon. You have to run a certain time to be even able to enter into the Boston Marathon.
Right.
And every time he tried to enter a race to qualify for the Boston Marathon to get his qualifying time, he would inevitably run into that time at the end of a marathon around mile 20 to 22, where you get a lot of negative thoughts. And those negative thoughts are like, I can't do this. This hurts too much. My body is not going to let me finish. And for about 5 to 10 years, he kept having this series of thoughts. And every time he would go into the next year, he would say, here we go again. This is going to happen again. And so one of my former athletes referred him to me, and we did a whole series of sessions on like how to manage those negative thoughts and how to treat them just like any other thought that comes and goes, and not get what we call fused, stuck with those thoughts. So teaching a technique called diffusion from thoughts. And then by the time he finished working with me, the next time he tried to qualify, he got to that same point in the race. And that thought started to come up. Oh my gosh, my hamstring's tying up. How am I going to do this? But this time, instead of quitting, he went back to all the mental training he did. And he said, okay, just manage this moment right here. This moment, that's it. And then he managed that moment, and then the next moment, and then the next moment. He worked out the cramp. And then over the last 3 miles, he ran as fast as 3 miles of the marathon.
Oh my gosh.
And got his Boston qualifying time. And the only reason he was able to do that was because he employed those practices. So like sports psychologists are not musicians or magicians. They're not, we can't like wish things away for you. So,
Right.
So that's why I see myself more as a coach, is I teach you the skills, here are the practices, and here's how often you should do it. And then the athletes that do that really well end up doing really well. The ones that adhere to the practices end up doing better. It's not going to make a mediocre runner into an Olympic runner, but it's going to make them as good as they can be and also have fun. Because like your 13 to 17-year-old volleyball players, if they're feeling a lot of stress, may end up feeling a lot less fun.
Mm-hmm.
And then the question is, why are we doing this?
Well, and then the parents go, why am I paying for this if they're not having fun?
Exactly.
And they're part of the problem too. It's a,
For sure.
it's a whole rant. But I imagine on the elite stage too, and every stage, talent-wise eventually evens out in the terms of like physical abilities on the elite stage. But then if you have that mental capacity, that helps you to edge out your competitors too.
Yes, for sure.
Fascinating. I took a sports psychology 101 class in college as an elective, and I loved it. I mean, very general, broad focus. And it was like, how can I keep going in this? And I wasn't a psychology major, but I don't think there was a sports psychology 201. And the teacher was like, well, it's a hard field to get into. And it's like, okay, well, but it's fascinating. As a former athlete, it was like, God, I wish I had this when I was growing up. I've had 3 ACL surgeries and always focused on the physical recovery. And I never had any mental recovery because I was so scared to get back on the court. And
right.
I could see the benefits. I hope I don't have to deal with any of those injuries again. But if I do, then I know I have to have a mental component as part of my recovery next time.
Yeah, for sure.
Bob, I know we just talked for an hour and a half plus on all kinds of different things. You are clearly a wealth of knowledge. You dabble in lots of different things,
Mhm.
and you're also a fabulous speaker. Fantastic. You just rattled off a whole bunch of answers and really made this so engaging. I have to ask you, have you always liked public speaking, or did you have to learn to love it yourself?
Yeah, I would say that I've definitely learned to love it over the years. I've also been doing it a while, right? So I started teaching almost 3 decades ago. So,
That
you
helps.
know,
Yes.
if you're routinely speaking to students who may or may not be interested in what you're saying, you have to figure out ways to be entertaining and improv. And so I love to bring a playfulness and a joy into my talks, whether it's to a professional audience or to students or my friends. Like I like bringing a playful energy. So that's one thing that really helps is I see conversation as play. And
I love
not
that.
meaning that it's not serious or it can't involve a lot of interesting exchange of ideas, but that it's a joyful experience. It's that idea, like from my colleague Dr. Keltner, of I see awe in what you and I are doing right now, and so that brings my heart into it. And if I could get my heart involved, then I'm always going to be a better speaker. And so when I speak at the Art and Science of Health Promotion or any other big national conference, there might be 200 people or 500 people or whatever, which could be intimidating. But as long as I remember like why I'm there and that I'm trying to share a message that I think will be helpful, then it feels like it aligns with my heart. And then I actually just get excited about it. I don't feel a lot of nerves in public speaking anymore. I'm not saying that I didn't originally. I think the first time I gave a talk at the Art and Science of Health Promotion, I was pretty nervous, but it was a very large conference and Bill Clinton was the keynote that year. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
there
Wow.
were a lot of people there and I felt the pressure and I definitely felt my heart pounding. But I reminded myself that that just means that I care. And I tell my athletes that too. And I think speakers, public speakers, if you get that heart pounding, it's just an interpretation thing of saying, wow, that means I care. That means I want this to go well. So let's do it. Let's have fun with this.
Mhm. I love that reframe too of don't be nervous in public speaking is of course we're nervous. Like you're about
Yeah.
to stand up in a very vulnerable state and present with
Right.
all eyes on you in front of a crowd. It is okay to feel those nerves. And then we don't have to have this like positivity about it. It's okay. I recognize I'm nervous. I have tactics and tools to help with those nerves. I can do my breathing routine. I can do my stretches. Also, I recognize maybe the first minute or two, not like my strongest voice or like a little shaky, but then I get into it and I flow and it's just beautiful after that. And that's what people remember too. They remember how you made them feel. And so
Right.
if you feel good, then it's generally going to go well if you feel good throughout the process.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I think if you can connect your message to stories and
Mhm.
heartfelt stories that are genuine and they're not designed to like, oh, I'm going to try and tug at the heartstrings of my audience. That I mean,
Yeah.
people can see through that. So the stories need to be your own, right? They need to be from your lived experience, and we all have them. We all have stories of trauma and heartbreak and joy, and people want to hear those. And if that can connect to the message that you're trying to convey, then it's more memorable. And again, you're speaking your truth as opposed to trying to cover X number of PowerPoint bullet points.
Exactly. Yep. I told you before we recorded, if we talk for an hour about ecstatic dance, we talk for an hour about ecstatic dance. I think we were a little shorter than that, but it was let's not limit ourselves. If that's where the conversation flows, that's where it goes.
Right.
And
For sure.
that's a beautiful thing, not being tied to that pressure or limitation piece.
Mm.
Bob, what's next on your journey? You've been teaching a while, you've been doing research. What's next on the journey?
Yeah. So I have 2 kids that just graduated from college, so helping
Oh,
launch them into the
congrats.
world. And then I have a younger son who is in between his first and second year. So when people ask me what I'm up to these days, I think I say I'm head of the feeding station at my house, which is whenever they come home, they need lots to eat. And
Yes.
Yeah, it's a home base for them. And then professionally, continuing to do ecstatic dance for the community. I'm expanding my research into some of the psychedelic-assisted therapies. I'm interested in potentially working around a new area for me, which is athletes who have traumatic brain injury that
Oh,
experience TBI, concussions in their professional sporting career. So, like hockey players, football players, boxers,
oh,
and then
wow. Yeah.
and then looking at the potential of some psychedelic assisted therapies for that group, because many of these people are young when they retire, and then they retire with a lot of pain, physical pain, psychological pain. Some of them have substance abuse disorders, and there's virtually no research, I think, on what the impact of a well held psychedelic assisted therapy would be, in addition to combining some of the sports psychology techniques and being in community, being in group. So I'm in some talks with some people that are doing really interesting work in that area, and hoping I can get a research arm into that. Yeah. And then continuing to mentor my students here. I love seeing what they do and helping them with their passions. The students at the college here are very passionate. They're very engaged with the community. So it's rewarding. I don't have any plans to jump off ship anytime soon.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Fascinating research areas and avenues to explore and make discoveries in, and the TBIs and athletes. And I mean, that would be incredibly helpful. I have to ask you, as a parent, and I'm a soon to be parent, I am trying to implement psychological flexibility. I use the term improv into my parenting.
Yeah.
And do you have any tips on just allowing for more improv and uncertainty in parenting?
I think what you're saying already makes sense to me, is that you're going into it with the idea that you're going to frame it with that this is all about flexibility, that this is all about responding to the need. So, like when I do internal family systems therapy with somebody, I never know what part is going to show up in my client, like what's going to be present for them that day, because it's different for everybody. And that's the same with as a parent. Like, you don't know what kid's going to show up.
Mm-mm.
I mean, is it the
No.
hangry, hungry, angry? Is it the loving? Is it the ADD kid? They're all over the place. And I wish I had known some of these techniques when my kids were 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. I was not trained in this back then. I was a health psychologist and a decent parent, but I got triggered way too easily, thinking that they're violating my boundaries. And so, yeah, there's a part of me that does wish I could do it again, knowing what I know now, and feeling the way that I feel about the world and them and my heart. So I would say the sooner you can get into that flow state of improv and connecting, obviously having children, there's usually a large purpose associated with that. And like just
Right.
reminding yourself constantly of what that purpose is for you and for your partner, if you have a partner, and what the kid's purpose is, which is,
Yeah.
they want to attach to you, they want to play, and then at other times they want to detach from you, and that's normal. And that we can't view that as rejection when they do that. That's part of their developmental challenges, is navigating how to stay close to mom and any other partner and any other caregiver, and how to navigate that, how to be in and out of that relationship. And if we provide that sort of stable grounding for them that's built in joy and humor and love, wow, that to me just feels like a gift.
My mantra for this whole process has been uncertainty is my friend. Because I have some anxiety. I have lots of anxiety about the future and just how I'm going to be as a parent. And I also remind myself, if my child needs to go to therapy, that means they're a well adjusted child. The
There you
stigma
go.
is removed there. Actually, that's a great thing that we are embracing the mental health benefits of therapy and talking with
Right.
somebody and working through issues and not wanting to avoid it. So, which I think was the goal of other parents years ago, of like, I don't want to mess up my child so much that they have to go to therapy kind of thing.
Right, right. Which it can be a joke, but it's also in reality a little bit of a fear-based approach, which is I don't want to
Yeah.
mess up, as opposed
Mhm.
to this more playful approach that you're talking about, where like I can see you wearing your clown nose and juggling and, you
I
know,
gotta
being
learn
sort of
how to juggle
and yeah,
first.
you're going to be juggling everything, and you're an entertainer for these kids, and then they see you enter their world with joy and happiness. Not all the time, but that's the model that they get, is that it doesn't have to be filled with angst and stress, you know.
That is
And
the goal. Yeah,
yeah, and obviously that's assuming some privilege too, right? That you're coming from a stable
absolutely.
place and that you've got a stable house. And I don't want to somehow suggest this is easy to do when other ends are difficult to meet, or when there's a lot of instability in the person's house
Health
or the culture that we
issues.
live in,
Yeah.
health issues. But we're all trying to do the best we can. And I think the other thing I would say would be to do it in community, is that
Mm.
particularly in the US, we've gotten this strange idea that we have to figure this out by ourselves. And there's so much to, like, we were parents of twins. And I think the biggest thing that was helpful to my wife was this group called MOMS, which stood for Mothers of Multiples.
Oh,
And like what
nice.
it was like to have twins that were 2 years old, and just having that support group built in.
That's really helpful. Yeah. There's a
Mm,
piece of me that's I could do it on my own. And I've learned that piece generally does better when there's community involved too.
right.
So asking for help more, being surrounded by community. Bob, I got one more question for you. I usually end with this with all the guests, and that is this podcast is about improv, and we've talked a lot about that. And yes and mindset is a part of improv. So, how do you embody a yes and or growth mindset in your life?
I love that question. It's interesting you asked that, because that's something that I say a lot to students and clients is, and I'll often spell it out. I'll say A and D, capital and, like,
Mm.
we can hold conflicting things at the same time, and we don't have to pit them against each other. For me, it looks like looking at what's going to challenge me and bring me joy and keep me growing. So, for example, we went to a beautiful dance performance last night. I turned to my wife at the end and I said, I want to be a dancer. And I'm not exactly the age to start like formal dance training right now. And I'm going to do it. I'm absolutely going to do it.
Yes.
Like, if that company will have me, they're a local company, I'm going to reach out to them and say, all right, I want to be a student. And because what they do is so beautiful, that'll be a practice for me, is to like get out of the shaming, judging part of being an older member of the troupe or of the class, and how to work on my physical flexibility, not just my psychological flexibility. But I was so moved by it. I just thought, I really want to do that. So I think that's an example for me, is yes, and going to, yes, I'm getting older and I'm going to learn how to dance, not because I want to be on the stage, but because it's just so beautiful.
I love that capital A and D. Yeah, because we
Yeah.
can hold both truths and still make it work out.
Hmm.
I love that. And you're already dancing. You just want to do it with this particular company. I mean, you already have a lot of you let go of the judgments and limitations.
Yeah, I have
You have
some
a
of
good
it.
foundation.
Yes. So we're going to build on that.
Yes, and make it happen. I can't wait to
Mhm.
see that journey more.
Thank you. Thank you.
But Bob, this has been wonderful, just engaging, enthralling. I've learned so much. I could talk to you for another 2 hours because you're just so good at it. But since we're ending here, where and how can our listeners find out more about you and see this dance journey, this research journey keep going?
Oh, thanks. Yeah. So I think the easiest place is just to find me on my college website. So you could just Google my name, Bob Swoap, and Warren Wilson College. And that's where I update mostly where I do, what kind of research I do. I have a resume, curriculum vitae. I do some stuff on Instagram. I might post like some dances, some playlists there. And that's just my name, Bob Swoap, bob.swoap. I do have a website that is in revision that there's a part of me that's a little ashamed to send people to, and it's robertswoap.com. And the reason is that it's really one dimensional. It's focused mostly on my sports psychology. And I'm in the process of working with somebody to revise it to and capture much more of the range of things that I do now. But that's certainly a place particularly if you're interested in sports psychology and how that also might apply to things like public speaking, because there's a lot of overlap between the anxiety that impacts athletes and people that are learning how to speak publicly. So that would be another spot. And if you're in Asheville, say, hey, come look me up.
Yeah. Maybe check out some ecstatic dance classes that you offer.
For sure. For sure. There's lots of great groups in town, and I'd be happy to answer questions if people reach out to me.
I love that. I like with the website, it's not quite ready, or it's not in its best form, and I am working on improving it and getting it to where I want it to be.
There you go.
Just that gentle reframe. Listen, I can do it for others, but then pointing it back to myself is always the harder challenge.
Thank you for the reframe. I will. Yeah, that's where we need to go.
Yeah. Bob, what a delight, a joy, a very playful conversation today about some very serious topics too. I just so appreciate you coming on, sharing with the world all these fantastic tips and knowledge. I'm just so incredibly grateful. I had the choice between going to ecstatic dance or going to dinner with some colleagues, and I chose your ecstatic dance class. And you know what? I'm sure dinner would have been delightful as well, but I'm so glad I went.
I'm glad you did too. It was really fun. It was playful. I enjoyed dancing with you and also just sharing that music and that approach with the whole group. And this conversation has been great. You asked great questions and I felt totally at ease with you. So thank you.
I hope to see you again at the next one, the next
Yes.
conference, Art and Science of Health Promotion, other wellness conferences. I say, bring ecstatic dance to all the conferences because honestly, everyone could benefit from this. I know you have other things to talk about and do, but if you want to promote ecstatic dance, the world needs to hear it and
All right.
experience
Sounds
it.
good. Let's do it.
Bob, thanks so much again, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Dana.
And thank you for listening to today's episode. Oh my gosh, what a gem of an episode. Just so much good stuff and information. I am definitely going to reel and reflect on all the things that were mentioned in today's episode. I want to call attention again to ecstatic dance. If you are in an area that has it, or look it up and see if this is something that intrigues you, you haven't heard of it. I hadn't heard of it until the conference a month ago. And my co-presenter, Jesse Greenfield, they were like, oh yeah, I do ecstatic dance in San Diego. And I was like, really? I am in LA. I'm sure it's in LA. I haven't really heard of it. And they were like, yeah, it's this amazing community. And I imagine it is just wonderful in all the places and spaces that it's offered. So if that hit your interest button and you felt intrigued by it, look it up, find one in your area, say yes and explore a bit. Yes, it's intimidating. There's no steps or choreo. There's no format. It's all just free flow. And of course, there is an instructor there to help make the space safe physically and mentally. But other than that, it's really just an exercise of one, moving your body and getting exercise, and two, letting go of judgment and allowing that brain to be with your body instead of being somewhere else, which is something that Bob mentioned in the episode. When I was doing my research on Bob, certainly we met at the conference and chatted a little bit, but I didn't get to talk with him a ton because ecstatic dance happened Thursday night and then the conference was over on Friday. And I ended up leaving around noon on that Friday to ride back with my friend. So I didn't get to really chat with him. And so I was doing my research for this episode and I wrote down so many questions for him. I mean, just like all of the areas that he dabbles in and works on, the ecstatic dance, the ketamine or psychedelic-assisted therapies, the health psychology, the mindfulness research, the sports psychology, as well as being a fantastic speaker and coach and therapist and teacher and instructor. It's incredible. So I probably had a good 3 to 4 hours worth of questions. And I said, Bob, whatever comes of this comes, we'll let it free flow. I have this list of questions, but I'm not tied to it. Let's just see where it goes. And I'm so happy with where it went because we touched on a lot of things. And honestly, we could spend an hour on each thing, like diving deeper. I understand that my podcast episodes are longer than probably the average podcast episodes, but I actually like that because honestly, if you limit the podcast to 30 minutes or 45, you get a chunk and you get a nice snippet, an idea of what the guest is about, but you don't get to really dive in on some things. And I don't know, I just felt like this conversation today was really special and very delightful, as Bob said. So thank you for being a part of it and listening. I will say probably my editor might disagree on the shorter episodes versus my long episodes, but we will agree to disagree on episode length and the benefits of it. There's so much coming up for me today from this episode, as I imagine you had some light bulb moments and kind of revelations and thoughts. For me, what's really present right now is the idea of being present in the moment. And planning ahead is okay, but not worrying so much about the future, because usually the things we worry about don't happen the way that we think they will. They don't happen at all. And so we spend so much time worrying about these things and thoughts that never come to fruition. And I am being very challenged by that right now. As a soon-to-be parent, I'm reading about all of these things that can come up with breastfeeding and sleeping. SIDS is a big issue. Sudden infant death syndrome is an issue with little babies and children. And you can read all these things and get very scared of like the worst case possibility and scenario. And certainly it is something that could happen, but also trusting my skills to be like, my instincts are going to take over. I am going to create a safe sleeping space for my child that will lower the risks of SIDS to the best of my ability. And that is what I can do. We will have all of the baby monitors on her, all of the things that we can to make sure that she is breathing while she sleeps. And it will all be okay. Uncertainty is my friend. Let's stay in the present moment and trust when things come up that we will handle them and that I will handle them. So a lot of that's coming up right now as we talked about mindfulness and being psychologically flexible, being present in the moment. So I want to turn it over to you as we're wrapping up here to just think about what is something that you might be stressing about or worried about. Maybe you're thinking ahead about, and can you come back to the present moment and connect with your body and be aligned in your mindfulness and your heartfulness? Why are you doing this thing that you're doing? Connect it with your heart, align it with your purpose, and trust that if anything comes up, it will be handled. Another thing that really spoke to me today in this episode is the idea of that capital A and D and how we sometimes allow the judgments and the shame to really take over and infiltrate our mind. And then that can create some of the unhealthy habits that we choose to do around it. For me, I get very overwhelmed and stressed about all the tasks that need to be done just with pregnancy and prepping for little baby to be here, but also at work, also with this podcast, also just with everything else. I'm an anxious, overwhelmed kind of person. And so what I tend to do in those situations is I'll say, I'm so overwhelmed. And then there's a part of me that just shuts down and doesn't want to do the tasks. And so I procrastinate and I make it worse. And then I stress even more. And so recognizing that I am overwhelmed, I do have a lot of tasks to do. And A and D, I am going to work on one of those tasks right now. And A and D, I'm going to set 30 minutes on the timer to work on this task. And it might not all get done. And I will work on it more tomorrow. So just having that capital A and D and really having that reframe will be very helpful for me. I hadn't heard it phrased like that. I like that a lot. So I will use that. Super fun, interesting, fascinating episode today. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Let me know if anything came up for you. Certainly reach out to Bob if you're in the Asheville area or even just curious more about ecstatic dance. You can also reach out to me. I'm on Instagram at Improvly Speaking. On LinkedIn, I'm at Dana Gowan. And my website is improvispeaking.com. Also, there's a new feature on Buzzsprout, which is what I use for my podcast host platform, where you can send fan mail to this podcast. So it's like a little text message, and you can send what came up for you in this episode, what you liked about it, what you like about the podcast. If you have any feedback or concerns or questions, ideas for improvement, you can also send that through fan mail. I don't think I can respond to it per se, but I can see it and know that you're listening and know that you got a lot out of it. You want more of these kind of topics, whatever's the case, whatever you're willing to share. But I'm excited about this new fan mail feature that Buzzsprout has. And I believe a link for the fan mail feature is listed on each of the episodes. So pretty cool. One more thing I wanted to highlight just about this episode is just how applicable everything is. Bob talked a lot about ecstatic dance and psychology and how we use these tools to really get out of our heads and be more present and be more psychologically flexible. All of these things are skills that can also help public speaking and improv. Bob did a great job tying it back. I just really enjoyed listening to it and just hearing how all of this kind of applies and ties in, right? I mean, I think that's the beautiful world of improv is like the skills that we use on stage to maintain and hold an improv scene on stage are also skills that we use in our lives and in our worlds. And it helps us better interact with others, and it helps us better interact with ourselves. And that's the key piece is how can we better treat ourselves and others? Thank you so much for listening and supporting Improvly Speaking. Go out and flex your creative thinking. I'll talk to you next time.